We are a research organization dedicated to advancing the prosperity of all Washingtonians. We're hosting these calls throughout the legislative session to provide relevant information and news from Olympia. If you haven't seen it yet, our last call is currently on the homepage of our website, budgetandpolicy.org. Just a few quick housekeeping notes. There are a number of people on the line, so we've muted all lines to avoid background noise. If you have any questions for us, please send them to us throughout the call, and we'll respond to as many as we can during the last few minutes. And we'd also love to hear from you if you have topic ideas for future calls. Please email them to us at bnpinfo@budgetandpolicy.org. The agenda for today's call is first to hear from Senator Jayapal on the $12 minimum wage proposal, and then we'll turn it over to Lori Pfingst, who will provide further statistics and analysis about raising the minimum wage in our state. So Senator Jayapal can be on for about the first 15 minutes or so. If you have any questions specifically for her, she'll have a few minutes to answer questions before signing off. And then you can direct any other questions to Lori Pfingst, and we will respond to as many as we can in the last few minutes at the end. If we don't get to your question, please email me at melinday@budgetandpolicy.org, and I'll refer your questions to our experts accordingly. So we can now get started. Senator Jayapal, you have the floor. So if you could start by briefly providing your thoughts on why the $12 minimum wage is good for the state and providing any updates you may have from Olympia regarding the proposed legislation, that would be great.
Thank you so much, and hello everyone. So pleased to be able to join you. I thought I'd just spend a few minutes saying quickly what the bill does for anybody who isn't entirely sure of that, why it's good for workers and for Washington State, and then maybe just talk briefly about who low-wage workers are and end with the state of the bills in the House and the Senate. So in terms of what this bill does, it essentially raises the minimum wage in the state to $12 over 4 years, and it does it extremely gradually. So as you know, we're at $9.47 now. January 1st of 2016, it would move to $10. January 1st of 2017 to $10.50, 2018 to $11, and 2019 to $12. And I think it's very important because a lot of people, I think of raising the minimum wage and don't realize that this is an incredibly gradual proposal. It's very slow. It actually only raises the minimum wage to a little over, I forget what the exact number is, maybe $1.17, I think, over what the minimum wage would be. But it is a critical piece, we think, to sort of continuing to address both the issues of income inequality and also continuing to encourage the economies in local jurisdictions across the state. So why $12? I mentioned income inequality, and while we don't by any means think that this is the answer to all inequality, we do know that Washington is one of 17 states where between 2009 and 2012, all the income growth accrued to the top 1%. That's important because at the same time, studies have shown that the average living wage in counties across Washington, depending on where you live in, can be anywhere from almost $15 to $21 for 2 adults and 2 children. So we are saying, look, this isn't going to get us everywhere, but a $12 living wage provides a beginning to raising the floor. It provides closer to a livable income for an adult in most of the state. It reduces the challenges posed by the policy gap, which is that those who don't make enough money to be self-sufficient but make too much to qualify for assistance. And 1 in 5 Washington households would benefit. I think that, I firmly believe in all the research from our $15 minimum wage struggle in Seattle really clearly showed that raising the minimum wage is good for local economies because those wages go right back into the economies and puts money in the hands of people who are most likely to spend it. These are not folks that are going to go out and buy a yacht or even be able to save money, unfortunately. We wish it were. But they're paying for basic expenses, and it really has shown across the country, and even in Washington State's experience, that it's good for our economies. And so there are statistics around that. Just a couple really quick ones. When the federal minimum wage rose 27% in 1990 to 91, Texas had an employment boost and prices didn't go up. Here in Washington State, we increased our minimum wage and indexed it to inflation. It's been going up. thankfully a little bit every year, and we were able to absorb those. So I think we see that moving right back into the economy. A lot of people think that minimum wage earners are teenagers and people who work part-time and live with parents, and this is just for extra spending money. This came up a lot in our $15 conversations, and it's coming up here in the state as well. But the reality is the average age of the minimum wage worker is 35 years old, and a lot of our minimum wage earners are people of color and women. And so this is a critical issue, I think, for being able to say that we are lifting the floor for people who are actually doing these jobs as their single job. This is not just pocket money. This is really what they're doing, and we need to be able to provide them with a wage that's going to allow them to exist. The state of the bills right now, as you may know, the Representative Farrell's bill in the House, and she has done so much work on this last year during the interim, and it's really an honor to be co-sponsoring the bill in the Senate with her. But that bill has moved out of committee and will go to the Appropriations Committee next. I really hope that we will be able to pass that bill in the House, and it looks good for that, but never speak too soon. Our challenge in the Senate is that I've introduced this bill. We got a lot of co-sponsors on it, including Senator Milosha from across the aisle did sign on to it as well. He was number 2 on the bill. But we have not been able to get a hearing, and Senator Baumgartner, who chairs the Labor and Commerce Committee, has essentially indicated that he won't hear it unless it comes over from the House. So I think, we need to be continuing to push on the fact that minimum wage initiatives are not democratic initiatives. They are bipartisan initiatives in states across the country, including Republican states. We saw minimum wage increases, and that's continuing to happen. And so this proposal, frankly, in my perspective, is an extremely reasonable proposal to raise the minimum wage. And I think that the polling across the state indicates that people across the state of both parties agree with us. 70% of people agree with us that this is a reasonable proposal and should be passed by the legislature. So that's what I'm really hoping that we can get to. And I believe that we have public policy on our side. I believe we have economics on our side. And I believe that what we're proposing is good for workers, good for Washington State, good for people of color, good for women. And that is really, it's an exciting moment actually to be in, even if we don't have a hearing yet in the Senate. I actually believe we're on the right path and moving forward. So I think I'll stop there, and maybe we can use the time for questions, and say too that a lot of the issues that I'm hearing here around, if people want to ask about particular arguments that are being made against raising the minimum wage, it's the same issues we dealt with in Seattle, so that feels very familiar, and we were able to get through that in Seattle, and I think we'll be able to get through that here as well.
Thank you so much for that. Just as a reminder to the listeners, we're not actually taking the questions over the speaker, so if you have any other questions for us, you can chat them to us through the Ready Talk program. But I do have a question to start with, just talking a little bit more about your work on the $15 minimum wage law in Seattle. Can you share any insight about what worked with the passage of that as it relates to making the case for an increased minimum wage at the state level?
Well, I think that Seattle was very different in part because you had a mayor who could pull everybody together, put them in the same room, and essentially force it to be hammered out. But I think that the discussions around what raising minimum wage does for economies and the research that was done around that has been incredibly effective, and I think has been sort of a base for what we're going to do. But I also think the organizing around 15, the appetite for raising the minimum wage, not only in Seattle but also in SeaTac, and kind of the groundswell that this is creating towards a state minimum wage, I think both of those have been very important. The big differences are in Seattle, that was a much bigger minimum wage. Now, we also phased it in over a much longer period of time. But some of the things that we discussed in Seattle and ended up with in terms of, a phased out credit for certain things, whether it was tips or whether it was tips or health insurance, those things are being misconstrued sometimes here. People say Seattle passed a tip credit. We didn't pass a tip credit. We had two different wages for large businesses and small businesses. And for the large businesses, there was a very tiny, small, phased out opportunity to count certain things towards that. But we were still increasing our base minimum wage significantly. So one of the things I've said to people here is, you want to talk about a similar deal to Seattle and you want to talk about $15 or something even higher, then those things may start to come into play. But this is a very simple bill. There's no compromises, no changes around a base minimum wage of $12.
Thank you. And I know you talked about there's a lot of common arguments in the opposition for this particular legislation. I'm wondering if you can talk just a little bit about your response to the common argument that raising the minimum wage would negatively impact businesses.
Well, the best evidence for that is our own experience in Washington when we raised the minimum wage and in states across the country. And all of the research shows that, of course, businesses open and close all the time. They will continue to do that if you raise the minimum wage. But what the net effect has been has not been a decline in employment in small businesses. In fact, you've seen economies grow, as I referenced earlier, when you raise the minimum wage. And if you just think about it separate from the research, it makes sense, right? Because you're a minimum wage earner, you're barely making ends meet. You get a raise in your minimum wage, it's probably going to go to food, to housing, to other things that are building and boosting the economy. And so there is a fear, I think, amongst businesses, and it's legitimate, particularly for the small businesses that are really hand-to-mouth. And that was an issue in Seattle because we were talking about a larger minimum wage. But here, we're talking about a 50-cent increase for the first 2 years. And so I think that this is, we've been just saying to people, let's actually look at what the numbers are and compare it to what the minimum wage would be doing anyway in Washington State. And what you see is it's a really tiny, tiny amount. And so this is not going to bring a business down. A business may go down, that's a different issue, but then there's lots of other issues for why that happens. It's not going to be because of a 50-cent increase in the minimum wage.
Thank you. So I know you have to sign off our call shortly, so I'm just wondering, is there anything else you'd like to add before you leave, perhaps suggestions on how participants can help make their voice heard on this issue in Olympia?
Well, since I come from a community organizing background, that's always my favorite question. It makes me feel like I'm back in my own territory. But I think that what we really need here in the legislature is for people to weigh in, to send their legislators real stories of struggling to exist on our current minimum wage, of particularly targeting, of course, the chair of the Commerce and Labor Committee, because it's going to be his decision to hear or not hear a bill. But I think doing it for all of the senators is important, or all of the representatives, actually, both in the House and the Senate, because I think people need to hear from folks on the ground about why this is important, why it's going to help, and the fact that people are supporting this and that they will support, and it's important to them to have their legislators weigh in. So phone calls, letters, personal stories, and then the other last thing I would say is talk to the people around you, because the more information, I really appreciate the Budget and Policy Center for all of the incredible work that you do to really put forward the facts of the situation. I think that's extremely important for people to get their hands on that and to be equipped with the answers to the most common concerns.
Thank you. And again, we really appreciate you joining us today, Senator. And if you need to head off, then we can just say thanks again and have a great weekend.
Thank you so much, everyone. Great to be on. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Take care. Now we are turning the floor over to our Policy Director, Lori Pfingst. Lori, many of our listeners have likely heard or read some of the common arguments against the $12 minimum wage proposal. One of the common arguments, for example, is that workers asking for a higher minimum wage aren't motivated enough to better themselves so they can get promoted to higher wage jobs. How do you respond to this kind of argument?
So in addition to the bettering themselves argument, the other arguments are that people don't really want to work hard or as hard as workers have done in the past, and that people feel entitled to more money without earning it. And, first of all, the characterization of the job market compared to yesteryear is way off. Our economy has changed from being one where we used to produce goods to where we produce services. And the suggestion that workers producing those services do not work hard is value-laden, and it's simply not true. People in industries with a higher share of minimum wage workers, food service, hotel workers, they do work hard, and that work should be valued. Part of our social contract is that a day's pay should pay for a day's living. And on top of that, wages have been stagnant for decades, for 35 years. Just last week, as Senator Jayapal mentioned, a report was released showing that all of the income gains in our economy have gone to the richest 1% in the economic recovery. And, our economy thrived when workers got to benefit from the economic activity that they helped to create. So we can't sustain an economy when such a small share of the population is benefiting. And then regarding bettering themselves, there's been an argument that people have every opportunity in the world to better themselves and get better jobs, and that the reality of that is also not true. Right now we have a state budget that isn't really adequate to make the investments we need for the opportunities that all Washingtonians need to get ahead. Budget cuts have made it harder for families to afford childcare, to afford higher education, to get job training that they need to better themselves. So minimum wage is one thing we need to be doing to make things better for workers, but there's also a lot we need to be doing so that everyone has the opportunities they need to get ahead.
Thank you, Lori. Can you provide some additional information just regarding some of the facts versus the fiction when it comes to raising the minimum wage?
Sure. So I just want to build a little bit upon what Senator Jayapal was talking about regarding some of the major myths. So the biggest myth is that raising the minimum wage is going to kill jobs. Minimum wage has been raised hundreds of times around the country, and those increases have been evaluated extensively in the literature. There are numerous studies looking at the impact on employment after raising the minimum wage, and the weight of that evidence shows that there is no discernible impact on employment. And the reason for that is because employers have multiple ways that they can absorb the increase. And as Senator Jayapal mentioned, this is a very responsible increase that's happening over 4 years and very gradually. And 23 states have also taken a similar approach in 2014 to raise their minimum wage. So there are multiple ways, given that there are multiple ways that employers can absorb the increase, there's no huge impact in any particular way. So for example, following a minimum wage increase, we don't see a huge spike in prices. We don't see a huge loss in non-wage benefits like cutting health insurance. And what the research strongly shows is that businesses actually get a return from greater investment in their employees through higher productivity and lower turnover, which actually saves money. So around the employment myth, the evidence is just not there. There are a handful of studies that show that there are decreases in employment. There are a handful of studies that show that there are increases in employment. But overall, there is no discernible impact on employment in raising the minimum wage. The other big myth that you start to hear is around teen employment. And teen employment is high in Washington State, but it's also high everywhere in the nation. And generally, the higher amount of teen unemployment is due to a number of other factors, including regional trends that are present in labor markets. And there's quite a bit of variation by region. And actually, evidence shows that a higher minimum wage helps teens and also helps disadvantaged workers to cover the cost of finding and keeping a job, including, for example, things like transportation, buying a uniform, and finding childcare. So again, the net evidence suggests that this is not a hardship on what many people consider to be disadvantaged workers. So overall, most of the critiques are on employment, whether that be overall employment or teens. Some people say that this isn't going to reduce inequality, and it won't reduce all of income inequality. The minimum wage is one strategy that we need to be pursuing. It reduces wage inequality, which is just one part of income. There are other things that we could be doing to reduce income inequality overall. And then also, a lot of people will say, well, shouldn't we just be focusing on economic growth and, then everybody benefits? And the fact is we've had economic growth for the last 40 years, and the vast majority of that growth has gone to the richest 1%. Wages have been stagnant for almost everyone else. I think what we've learned is that when we hit historically high rates of inequality, our economy crashes. That happened before the Great Depression. It happened before the very recent Great Recession. And again, we simply cannot sustain an economy when such a small share benefits. And minimum wage is one thing. We can also implement a capital gains tax. We can implement a working families tax rebate. We can pass paid sick leave, and we can implement paid equity for workers. So there's a whole host of issues on the table in Olympia this year that would tackle the bigger problem of income inequality.
Thanks, Lori. We do have time for questions now, so I'll go ahead and get started with a question that came in. Someone was wondering how would increases in minimum wage affect other wages, and does that mean everyone at a company will get an increase?
So there is some evidence in the literature that when you raise the floor, that other people see a raise in that other people see a raise as well. So that's called a ripple effect that happens in companies. But generally, it doesn't affect cost in a huge way because there is also some evidence that there's wage compression just at the very, very top. So that while lower to moderate wage workers will see an overall increase, those at the top might not see as high of an increase. So there's some evidence to suggest that there's a little bit of wage compression and that low to moderate wage workers do experience an increase.
Great. Does anyone else have any other questions for us? All right. Did you have anything else to add, Lori?
I think I would just reiterate that this is a really a great thing that we can do for workers. But again, there's a lot of great things on the table that could be done to strengthen workers and their families, which ultimately benefits businesses and communities and our overall economy. So, just like Senator Jayapal said, any way you can share your thoughts on the matter would be great.
All right. Thanks so much, Lori. So we will be signing off now unless we get any last-minute questions coming in, and it doesn't look that way. So thank you all so much for joining us today. And again, many thanks to Senator Jayapal for participating in the call. If you would like to listen to this discussion that we're recording, we'll be posting the call to our website at budgetandpolicy.org. Thanks again, everyone, for listening, and have a great weekend.